In the hands of the Master, we are not forgotten lumps of clay. We are shaped, molded, crafted with care. As the potter works with purpose, so God shapes us. Flaws, cracks, and all. He is the artist. We are His masterpiece in the making. Yet, O Lord, You are our Father. We are the clay. You are the potter. In His hands, we become more than we ever imagined. We become the Master's piece.
Today, I'm not going to give a Mother's Day message per se, but we are going to talk about a conversation between a mom and her son, and a mom who had a significant impact on history and on this particular son's life. Jesus, right? We're going to talk about Mary and Jesus. And we're going to pick up our series on the masterpiece, the potter and the clay, and we're going to look at John chapter 2, where Jesus performed his very first miracle. And if you know the story, you know that Jesus turned the water that was in these 6 stone jar pots into wine and saved the disaster at the wedding running out of wine. And so if you want to look with me in John chapter 2, if you have it on your digital device or you brought your Bible with you or you want to follow along with me on the screen, we're going to read the story in John chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." And they did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine, and he did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now." So before we take a deeper dive into this story, I want to give us some interesting facts, some history around it, so we can better understand the context of this story. So first of all, we know that Jesus was in attendance with his disciples and his mother, and possibly members of his family. It was probably close by where he had been staying and been living, and so there was a whole crowd that came that he knew at this wedding. And it's not too far-fetched a thing, as I was doing some research on, that suggested from some of the commentaries that Mary possibly could have been a part of coordinating or organizing the wedding, hence her reason for coming to Jesus and saying, "Jesus, we're out of wine," and looking to him to provide for that. Now, running out of wine in a Jewish wedding was a social disaster. First of all, the wedding and the celebration lasted about 7 days. And the bulk of the financial responsibility fell on the bridegroom and not the bride's family. Now, my husband and I had 3 sons, and so I'm not sure when that switched, but I think we were a little grateful for that, although we tried as much as we could to help with the expense of our boys' weddings. But because the wedding lasted so long, they needed to provide lots of food and lots of wine. But to run out of supplies would be a dreadful embarrassment on especially a shame culture. And there is some evidence that also could lay the groom open to having a like a lawsuit or being taken to court from relatives of the bride who were unhappy that they didn't provide well for them. And the third thing that I want to bring to your attention in this kind of a fact is that when you think about it, here's Jesus' first miracle, but also this is the first couple, their first event together, their wedding, their celebration, and they had a crisis. This was one of their first crises, but Jesus intervened and he saved the crisis for this couple. And the fact that there were 6 stone jars on hand is no accident, not the number 6, but if you look throughout the Gospels, I love when you see Jesus' miracles. Jesus uses what's on hand in front of him, and that's no accident how God provided those things for him to do the miracles that he did. Now let's look at the dialogue between Jesus and his mother. It's very short, but if you look at it as a script, here you have Mary. Mary comes to Jesus and she says, "They have no more wine." And then Jesus says, "Woman, why do you involve me? Woman, why do you involve me?" Now you could look at this and say, wow, that's kind of rude of Jesus to talk to his mother like that. But if you heard me preach over a year ago at Easter, Jesus used this same term when he spoke to her from the cross, when she was at the foot of the cross. He said, "Woman, behold your son." So it's not necessarily supposed to be an insult or rebuff. It's just a very way of how they spoke to their mothers in that time. And it's the same word actually that Jesus uses with the Samaritan woman at the well. The same term that he uses there. Now, she could have taken this as a result or a rebuff, but she didn't. One of the scholars of John says this. It's Frederick Dale Bruner. He says this: "For as Christ's mother had allowed if she had allowed those harsh words to frighten her, she would have gone away silently and displeased. But in ordering the servants to do what he might tell them, she proves that she has overcome the rebuff and still expects of him nothing but kindness." Now, Kevin and I raised 3 boys, and my boys, my adult sons, have said that to me at times. They have said, "Mom, why are you telling me this?" So that's more of what the context is here. And my boys will look at me and like, "Mom, why are you telling me this? Like, what do you want me to do about it?" And I think it might be a boy thing too. But in other words, in this case, Mary knew what Jesus was capable of. He knew. She had known the miraculous conception, his birth, all of that, raising him as her child. And she knew that even as she stood at the cross later on, as she was to stand at the cross, he was not just her son, but he was her Savior. So she knew if anybody could solve this problem of not having enough wine, it was Jesus. Now, Pastor Bob talked about last week in the introduction to this series that if we believe that God is the potter and that we are the clay, we have to be willingly and joyfully malleable. We have to be willing not to fight the potter on the potter's will and allow him to shape us as he desires so we can be useful and reflect God's image. After all, we sang about that this morning. We are made in God's image. And as Psalm 139 says, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that he knit us together in our mother's womb. We are priceless from the beginning. So in other words, to be malleable, pliable, we have to be willing, as Mary so wisely said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you. So how do we do what Jesus tells us to do? Well, I believe it's right here in the text. I believe that in my research and some of the commentaries I looked at, some of the scholars have said that besides the literal story of Jesus doing this miracle, there's a lot of allegorical and a lot of symbolism in this story. And there's so much we could uncover with that. But I want to focus on what Jesus says and what he does next and what Mary told the servants, do whatever he tells you. So the first thing that Jesus does after Mary says to the servants, do whatever he tells you, he tells the servants, fill the jars with water. Fill the jars with water. Now, these jars were used for Jewish ceremonial washing. And we've learned through our series last year, I believe, that Pastor Bob has said, and I've read this, that there were over 600 rules and regulations that the Jews had to follow through with the old law. But the Pharisees and the Sadducees added to that. So they added all these extra things. They had to have the ceremonial washing. And so they thought by keeping this water in these stone pots, that would have less chance of it being contaminated. So it wasn't just for drinking, it was more for ceremonial washing. So there is a sign here that God was doing a new thing from the inside out through this story. He was purifying Israel in a new way, and that is the same thing that Jesus wants to do for us. In 2 Corinthians 4:7, it says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." So the context of what Paul is saying here in 2 Corinthians is that because our treasure is the Spirit of the Holy Spirit and Jesus that lives and resides in us. And the clay is our brokenness, our woundedness, our bruisedness, all the things we experience, but that we hold a treasure in a cracked pot, so to speak. You and I are each a jar of clay, and if we are a Christ follower, then we hold the treasure of the Spirit of God within us. So what we hold and what we put in our jars is very important. What we fill them up with, how we live. So when we are doing what Jesus is telling us to do, then we fill those jars and we hold that treasure, which is the Spirit of God, closely. Another example is in Luke chapter 5, in the verses 5-6, where we see Jesus is calling his first disciples, and he says to Simon Peter in particular, they've been fishing, and he tells them to put their nets on the other side of the boat. And Peter, you can see he's struggling with this, but he says, and in one translation, he says, "Because you say so, I will. Because you say so, I will." As a mom, I would tell my boys when they'd say, "Why, Mom? Why do I have to do this?" I would say, "Because I say so, because I'm your mom." Because you say so, I will, as Peter said. Now, in each of these stories in the gospel, Jesus was resourceful and he used what was on hand. The same is true for us. When God asks us to fill our jars up to the brim, he uses what have on hand, our life experiences, our skills, our gifts, our talents, how he has made us, our personality, and that's what he uses for us to be a light to the world. That's why we are to hold the treasure, but the jar is what God uses in order to take the gospel and the light to the world. Now, the second thing Jesus said is, "Now draw some out." Now draw some out. So he told them to fill it up, and then he tells them to draw some of the water out. The servants had done what Jesus said, and so then when we do this, when we do what Jesus says and fill our lives to the brim with what God asks, he then, and here's the key, he then does the miracle inside of us. Now, Jesus could have just had the water fill up itself, but he told the servants to fill it up. But when we do what Jesus asks in the same way, that's when the miracle takes place, the transformation, so to speak. And the miracle, what happens in us when we fill up what Jesus asks us to do, is the transformation in our lives, the healing in our lives. He repairs the broken pieces and the cracked pots in our lives. And it's our hearts, when it's drawn out, that's when others can see the miracle in our lives. And it is because of what Jesus has done in us in the process of making all things new. When I was a young mom, I struggled very significantly with anger. And I grew up in a father who was very angry, an angry man, and yet he would say he was sorry continually. It had its impact on us as kids. But as an adult, a young adult, I got to witness the transformation of my dad when he submitted that to Christ and see God change his life and change that angry part of him. And it was such a beautiful thing to see. But as a mom, because that had been embedded in me as a child, I wrestled with it greatly. And it didn't help that I was taught that my anger was wrong. I was a little girl who had very big emotions, and I still have big emotions that I have to deal with continually. But when I learned, I didn't know how to deal with my anger as a child because I was told that it wasn't right, and I didn't understand what Ephesians says, that be angry and do not sin, right? I didn't know that anger was a God-given emotion, but it's just what I did with it that made it right or wrong. So as a young mom, I struggled and wrestled with this greatly. And one day, when I had kind of an epiphany, an aha moment, when God got a hold of my spirit, was when our 7-year-old oldest son, we had a long hallway in our house with the bedrooms and a bathroom, and there was a closet at the end of the hallway. And I was angry about something. I'm not sure what it was, but I watched the face of my little boy, and I watched his body back up like this as I kept approaching him in anger, and I saw the terrified look on his face. And I realized in that moment that God gave me a picture of my own childhood and how terrified I was of my own father at times. And I realized in that moment that I didn't want to be that kind of a mom anymore, and I needed to do something about it right away. The key in this story is to do whatever he tells you. And so I knew in that moment that I needed to deal with it. I needed to not wait a week or 2 or a month to get help on how to deal with my anger. I needed to do it right away. You see, when God tells us to do something, it's like Psalm 119:60, which says, I will hasten and not delay to obey your commands. In another translation, it says, I will hurry and not delay. I knew I needed to do something right away if I wanted to break that cycle of anger that had been in our family for several generations. So we fill our lives up to the brim with what God tells us to do. We draw some out, knowing that the treasure and the miracle is inside of us. And then the third thing Jesus says is he says, take it to the master of the banquet. Now, the master of the banquet was the event planner, so to speak. He was responsible for dispersing the food and the wine and making sure that everything happened according to the bridegroom's family. So when we do what Jesus tells us to do, when we fill it up, we draw it out, and then we take that miracle inside of us to our sphere of influence to bring God's glory with the ordinary, the water, so to speak, and he turns the ordinary in our lives to the extraordinary, which really is the miracle of the potter and the clay. So when Mary says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do, she's embodying the complete trust in her son. The complete trust in her son, just like we are to do. When God tells us whatever I tell you to do, Cynthia, then I have to respond in complete trust that God knows what he's doing, and I'm not going to be the clay that jumps off the potter's wheel and try to do it my own way, which we do at times. And then we have chaos and lack of peace. When Isaiah 26:3 says this, you will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. When we do what Jesus tells us to do and we are determined, then we can have peace, we can relax, we can rest, and we can be content, because we can be kind of like, if you've ever had a massage, you get out of there and you're just kind of like Jell-O. You're malleable, right? We can be malleable in the potter's hands because we trust that he will shape us into whatever he has purposed us to be. N.T. Wright, a theologian and brilliant scholar, he says this about this story. This story is about transformation, the different dimension of reality that comes into being when Jesus is present, and when, as Mary tells this servant, people do whatever Jesus tells them. You see, transformation only comes when we do what Jesus tells us to do. So if you want transformation if you're in your life, and I want transformation in my life, I want my life to be different. I want it to make a difference and matter for the kingdom. I have to be willing to do what Jesus tells me to do, no matter the cost, no matter whatever I think I should speak against that. And then Charles Spurgeon says, if our needs stand before us like huge empty water pots, or if our souls are as full of grief as those same pots were filled up with water up to the brim, Jesus can, by his sweet will, turn all the water into wine, the sighing into the singing. We should be glad to be weak so the power of God may rest on us. And I love that, what Charles Spurgeon says. And so the work that Jesus is doing in our lives, the clay that he's molding and shaping us to be, it isn't his hobby. It's not, we aren't just a hobby for him. We're not some great experiment. God molds us and shapes us because he has purpose for us, because he wants us to be useful vessels, just like the water in the stone clay jars. He wanted that to turn into wine to make a difference. I love that. So in honor of celebrating all mothers and all women today, I want to tell the story of 3 women who were exactly that. They were malleable. They did what Jesus told them to do, at great sacrifice and great cost sometimes. And you know, sometimes there's a lot of women in history that have done some remarkable things for Jesus. And I'm just finding out a lot of these women, their stories inspire me. They inspire me to, and after I read their stories or I watch something about them, I just like, God, I am such a wimp. I am such a wimp. Help me to be more malleable, because we are such a self-sufficient society. We try to change and transform and do things on our own, when really we just need to do what God tells us to do. So the first woman I want to talk about is Adelaide Pollard. And she wrote the song, as we mentioned last week, Bob mentioned this, Have Thine Own Way. And she was at a prayer meeting one night, and there was an elderly woman who responded this way: does anybody have any blessings or prayer requests? But she just spoke out loud, and she just said, this older woman said, it really doesn't matter what you do with us, Lord. Just have your way. And this so inspired Adelaide Pollard that she went home that night and wrote the 4 verses of the song, Have Your Own Way. Now, she wrote over 200 hymns, but this is the one that is most beloved by the church. And I know I heard this growing up as a child in my own church. But the reason it impressed her so much is because she was in an incredible time of distress that time. She had been trying for a long time to go to Africa and raise the funds. So as a single woman in 1902, that was a really tough thing to do. She was turned away many times, and she couldn't raise the money on her own, and she also had very frail health, but she really felt determined to do that. So what she did instead is she moved to Chicago, and she became rather a well-known Bible teacher, and she started teaching in a missionary school. Well, she finally got to realize her dream, and she got to Africa for a short time just prior to World War I, and then spent the rest of her war years in Scotland. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. So those words had very significant meaning for her, waiting to do something that she wanted to do for God. The second woman I want to talk about is Francesca Cabrini. Francesca Cabrini. She was born 2 months premature in 1850. She was the last child of 13 children. And this, when I read this, I had to go back and check to make sure I had this accurate. Her mother was 52 years old when she delivered this child. When I was 52, I was a grandmother already, but 52 years old. And she was the last of 13. And she was in delicate health most of her life. She had an overwhelming fear of water because she almost drowned as a child, and yet she crossed the Atlantic over 20 times during her lifetime. From an early age, she was fascinated by missionary stories, and her dad would read the children these stories, especially about missionaries that went to China. And so just a word for your dads, when you read these kind of stories to your kids, these faith hero stories, it can make a difference in your child's life. So hearing these stories, she wanted to be a missionary, but she'd been rejected by many religious communities because of her poor health. They just basically told her, you're too sick to do anything for Jesus. But she was determined. So finally, a local bishop recognized her zeal and boundless energy, and he came alongside and helped her. And she started some schools and institutions in Italy. Well, this caught the attention of the Pope. And so she was granted an audience of the Pope because she had a big dream. And she wanted to go to China. So she went to the Pope and had an interview with him, and he discouraged her from thinking about China, but rather look to the West. There are many Italian immigrants in New York who really need your help. And so she, along with 6 other sisters in her religious community, showed up in New York. She was almost 40 years old in 1889 to begin caring and loving for the Italian immigrants' children, in particular, in an area called 5 Points, which was a horrific place in New York at the time. The police wouldn't even go in there. It was filthy, lots of poverty, lots of crime. Every immoral thing you could think about happened at 5 Points. And she faced so many obstacles, and the religious leaders and the city tried to shut her down many times, but she did not give up. Not only that, because of her ill health, the doctor would tell her every year, you have 1 more year to live. And then he would be amazed that she would live another year. Well, Mother Cabrini lived to be 67 years old, and she created and founded 67 institutions, schools, orphanages, and hospitals around the world, 1 for every year of her life. She was known to use this phrase, the world is too small. I would like to embrace it all to reach every corner. And then if you want to see the movie is fabulous. It came out last year. I've seen it 3 times. But there's a line in the movie that she says, begin the mission and the means will come. Begin the mission and the means will come. The last woman I want to talk about is Marie Enns. Marie Enns. In the early 1990s, Marie Enns found herself to be a widow. She had been serving alongside of her husband in Cambodia and in Europe to the Cambodian people for nearly 50 years with her husband. But she found herself a widow in the early 1990s. Well, in 1994, she went back and had one of her first exposures with the AIDS crisis. And her heart was moved, and she began to realize the devastation of what had happened there. Well, her mission organization told her that she was about ready to retire. She was 65 years old, but she just didn't feel like she needed to retire. And she wanted them to send her back to Cambodia so she could begin and help the AIDS crisis there with orphans that were left, with women, moms, and with grandmothers and grandfathers that had been abandoned on the streets at times. I don't know if you know much about Cambodia, but it's a very poverty-stricken country and doesn't have a lot of political infrastructure, especially after the killing fields and all of that happened during those years. But the irony of this story is that she wasn't ready to retire, and so she didn't listen to her mission. She actually took her own life savings, her retirement savings, and went to Cambodia to begin this mission. And the thing that God impressed upon her, he shared with her the story of Abraham and spoke to her, grow old with me, the best is yet to come. The best is yet to come. The best is yet to be. And so in 2004, an AIDS center opened in 2002, and the first children came to live in the orphanage of 2004. So the mothers would come with their kids. The mothers would be infected with AIDS. Many times the children were too. When the mothers passed away, then they took care of these orphans. And I had the privilege of being able to see and witness her dream in 2007. I was there, and I was just blown away about how much God had done in a short period of time. And she also talked about this dorms that she wanted to build in the city so that when the children grew up, that they actually would be able to earn a wage earning living, because in Cambodia, many parents, if they couldn't take care of their kids, they would sell their children or sell them into human trafficking. And so unless you had something, a job or something, it would be hard to survive. So she wanted to make sure that those kids would be able to grow up and actually sustain and be able to live and bless the others around them in Cambodia. So today, the rescue is what it's called, has 3 centers of orphans. She calls them grannies, and the AIDS houses with the moms and the kids. In addition to the centers, it also has 3 university dorms, the House of New Dreams. And Marie is in her mid to late 80s, and she is still going strong. It's amazing to me. She's just been a really delight and a pleasure to support and to pray for. So what do these 3 women have in common? They took Mary's word to heart. They did what Jesus told them to do, no matter the cost, the sacrifice, the inconvenience, and the hardship. They followed Jesus one yes at a time. Now, God might not be calling you overseas to start an orphanage, but he has a call and a purpose for our vessels to be used right here where we live. That's where we start, right? We just say yes to Jesus and be willing, and he plants seeds and dreams in our hearts to do whatever he tells us to do. And then the rest is history. And then our impact can be huge. And it might not be in these 3 stories, but it is huge in the people's lives that we touch. And I'm so grateful for that God has helped me to understand that my influence in my brokenness and that treasure that I hold can make a difference in this life.